much for joining me today. We are going to continue our study of 1 Kings by looking at 1 Kings 17 and 18. Let's pray as we get started. God, I thank you so much for today. I thank you that we get to continue to open your word together. I pray that as we do so, that you will be glorified and that you will transform our hearts and our lives, God. We love you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So as I said, we are going to be in 1 Kings 17 and 18 today. And if I'm being truly honest, we are getting to the part that is one of my favorite sections of 1 Kings. And that is the part about Elijah. So he's going to show up on the scene today. So last week, we left things in chapter 16 after having covered a series of kings of Israel. And we read about Omri, who was a king of Israel, and he was succeeded by his son Ahab. And so we kind of left things off right when Ahab became the king over Israel. And I wanted to kind of look at a little bit of that at the end of chapter 16 as we get started today. We find out here, beginning in 1 Kings 16, verse 29, about Ahab's reign. And we get the summary statement of it. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's not very long. And that way we can talk about it just a bit. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, and he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. So it's definitely a stinging description of King Ahab. He is described as having done more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. And primarily because he not only committed all the sins of Jeroboam, leading the people to do the same, but he married Jezebel, who was a foreign princess from the area of Sidon, which was closer to the coast. If you were to look at a map of ancient Israel, Sidon would lie between the northern kingdom of Israel and the Mediterranean coast. And so that is where she was from. And she brought with her worship of Baal. And Ahab embraced it wholeheartedly and built a temple there in Samaria. So Ahab led the people into worship of Baal and continued worship of Asherah. Now Baal was the god of agricultural fertility, and the god of thunder and rain. And so we're going to see that play out over these next couple chapters in 1 Kings. Because there's going to be this contest between Baal and between the one true God. And so we're going to see that played out as we get into this. Well, one other thing I wanted to note about Jezebel, which I found very interesting. So the name Jezebel, in the Hebrew pronunciation of it, so if we were to look at this in the Hebrew, the commentary I was reading made the point that she was held in contempt by the Israelites, who would have written this down and carried this history forward. And so they changed the pronunciation of her name to sound very similar to the pronunciation of the word for dung. So she was not held in very high regard. And it comes out even in the way that it is recorded here in 1 Kings. And I just found that fascinating. One other thing I wanted to point out in this first little section that we've talked about at the very end of chapter 16 is this note about the rebuilding of Jericho. And it seems kind of out of place when we're reading through this. And that's what I thought when I was reading too. And one thing I wanted to bring up here is that, well, one, we have both Ahab and then this man, Hiel, building doing building projects that would not have been what God wanted. So Ahab built this temple, and Hiel built Jericho. And if you remember all the way back to Joshua, whenever the Israelites are going to march around Jericho and God is going to deliver that city into their hands, Joshua says in Joshua 6 that so if we flip over there really quick, he says that there is going to be a curse on anyone who rebuilds the city of Jericho. So look at Joshua 6:26. He says, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath. Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations, and the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates. And so that is the curse that we see being enacted here. So Hiel also, just like Ahab, was continuing to build things that were not pleasing to God. And kind of this is a statement on just the overall negative impact that King Ahab was having on his people. But it wasn't just Ahab, it was the people were following right along. And so it wasn't just the king who was doing these evil things, but the people were participating in them as well. And that is what we see here with the rebuilding of the city of Jericho. So the stage is set. Ahab has brought idol worship, the worship of Baal, into the nation of Israel. And God responds by sending his prophet Elijah to call the people back to covenant faithfulness, back to the covenant that they made with God at Mount Sinai, the covenant that God has been continuing to uphold, that he's calling them back to that. And so Elijah comes into the picture right here at the beginning of chapter 17. We find out Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab. So he comes to Ahab and he tells him, hey, there's going to be a drought. It's not going to rain in the next few years except at my word. So we are not given very much information about Elijah. We're just told he's a Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead. So if you remember back to when the people of Israel, the Israelites, were coming into the land back in the time of Joshua, the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh wanted to settle in the land on the east side of the Jordan River. And this would have been the region of Gilead. And so they settled there, but they continued to help their fellow Israelites conquer the land as they continue to move into it. And then they returned to the land that they had chosen as their inheritance after that period was over. And so that would be the region where Elijah was from. And so if you look at a map of ancient Israel, it labels Gilead as this region. And so we have Elijah saying there's going to be a really big drought, a massive drought. Now, drought is something we are definitely in here in Corpus this summer, and it is very hot and very dry, and it feels like it hasn't rained in a million years. But it has rained here more recently than it was going to rain in Elijah's story here. He said a few years. I can't imagine what a few years of drought would feel like. But this isn't just any drought. This is a drought that is part of the curse for Israel not following through on maintaining the covenant that they agreed to do. So if we flip over to Deuteronomy 28 and we look, the first part of Deuteronomy 28, we see the blessings for obeying and being obedient to the covenant that they made with the Lord. Then we look starting in verse 15 and through quite a lot. There's a lot of verses. If we're starting in verse 15, reading through the end, we see the consequence for not upholding the covenant. So I wanted to look at just this first part. So starting in Deuteronomy 28:15, it says, however, if you do not obey the Lord and do not carefully follow his commands and decrees I'm giving you, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. Let's skip down to verse 24. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust and powder. It will come from the skies. It will come down from the skies until you are destroyed. So we have this idea that drought is part of the punishment for not being faithful to the covenant. And choosing to worship Baal and choosing to worship other idols is a good example of not being faithful to the covenant. And so this is what's happening here. We're seeing it played out. God immediately sends Elijah, though, to say, hey, people, you can still come back. And so that's what we're going to see here. And so as we look through chapter 17, we're not going to read huge sections of chapter 17, but I just wanted to kind of point out a few things here. We see this contest starting to unfold between the one true God and this idol called Baal. And what better way to show the supremacy of God than for God to send a drought? So Baal was the god of rain and agricultural fertility and all of those things. And so God is sending this drought, and that is God just reminding the people, hey, like, I'm in charge of all of this. I'm in charge of the crops growing because I'm the one who is sending these things to take care of you. But at every turn in chapter 17, we see God being portrayed as the one who sustains life and even restores life. So we see him sustain Elijah. He sends Elijah into the wilderness to be fed, and he feeds him by ravens, and has him drink from water from a brook. So the ravens bring him food. They bring him food, and he was able to drink water from the brook for a while. He did this for a while. And then after the brook dried up, God sustained Elijah's life by bringing him to the region of Sidon, which is very interesting. So he sends him to the widow at Zarephath, which was in Sidon, which would have been outside of the territory of Israel. So he sends Elijah to a foreign widow, and God provides for Elijah's needs for food and this woman and her family's needs for food in a very miraculous way by making the amount of flour and olive oil that she had, the very little amount, never run out. So God continues to sustain life. And not only does he sustain life and care about the people of Israel, but he also cares about people in other regions, this foreign widow. And then this widow's son dies. And we see Elijah pray to God that his life will return. And God raises this son back to life, restores his life, bringing the widow to a point where she can say at the end of chapter 17, now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. She goes from doubt, we see her doubting earlier in chapter 17, to a place of faith and understanding to the level she could about who Elijah was and the fact that his God is the real one, the real deal. So I encourage you to definitely read that whole section. We see God being portrayed over and over in this passage as being the sustainer and restorer of life. And this brings us to 1 Kings 18. And the first thing we find out in 1 Kings 18 is that Elijah's not the only follower of God left. We find out that within Ahab's own household, his own close advisors, he has a follower of the one true God in Obadiah, who had gone out of his way and put his own life on the line to protect some of the prophets of God that Jezebel had been trying to kill. And we see his interaction with Elijah. And he is the one who goes back to Ahab to say, Elijah is here to meet with you. Because that's what chapter 18 starts with. God telling Elijah, go and present yourself to Ahab. And so he does that by encountering Obadiah, and then Obadiah returning to King Ahab and saying, okay, Elijah's here. And so we're going to pick up this story in verse 16. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you troubler of Israel? I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. So before we keep going, I just think it's so interesting that Ahab blames Elijah for all of this mess and the drought and all of this. But yet Ahab and his family and the people are the ones who have brought this on themselves. They were clearly warned. We read the part in Deuteronomy. The people heard this, they agreed to this covenant. They were told what would happen in advance if they broke it. And we see them fall and break it. But yet, Ahab wants to blame Elijah. So Elijah is going to respond by asking Ahab to gather up all of the prophets of Baal, all 450 of them, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. He wants them all to meet him on Mount Carmel because something's about to happen. So I'm going to start reading here in verse 21, and I'm going to read this section. And as I read it, I want you to listen with all of your senses and really try to imagine the scene. Pretend maybe you're an onlooker there and you're just watching it happen in real time, and just see what you notice and see what stands out to you in this scene, because it's very vivid and very interesting. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." And the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces, and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it, since there are so many of you." So he lets them go first. "Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted, but there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made, and at noon Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood and the stones and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. So what a story. What a vivid display of God's power. I love how God just works through Elijah in such miraculous fashion. And I also really love, as I was studying this week, all of the different ways that this is such an affront to the prophets of Baal and the worshipers of Baal. Even the place where they were up on Mount Carmel. This was a mountain on the border territory between Israel and Phoenicia. So Phoenicia was what laid near the coast. And so this mountain was up near the sea. It was a seaside mountain. It would have been lush and it had abundant rain. And here in the midst of this, it would have been a site for Baal worship. And here in the midst of this mountain, where they would have come to worship Baal, God shows Baal to be nothing, a complete nothing, no voice, no response. Only God hears. And we see Elijah call on the people to make a choice right at the very beginning. You need to choose. Stop wavering back and forth. Choose God or Baal. And how the prophets of Baal go about trying to invoke Baal's name and get him to act. It's just very overwhelming, the lengths they're willing to go to try to force their God to do what they wanted. They thought they could dance around. They thought do ritual dances. They thought they could slash themselves. They thought they could just shout really loud. But Baal didn't hear them because Baal can't hear because Baal is an idol. And then when Elijah turns to his turn to call on the name of his God, the imagery that we see here of taking 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, and then having the 4 jars be poured over 3 different times. So 4 jars times 3 times, 12 jars of water poured over the sacrifice. And then Elijah invokes the name of the Lord, and he ties the God of their God, his God, all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Normally we would hear the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, Jacob was named Israel. And he reminds the people of who they are, calling them back to covenant faithfulness. You are these people and this lineage. This is the God you should be serving. This is the one true God. And God responds with fire. And probably was a lot like lightning. What an affront to Baal, the God of thunder and rain. God is sovereign, and he does not share. He wants the people to have sole allegiance. He doesn't want us to have divided allegiance. He doesn't want idol worship. He wants pure hearts who follow him wholeheartedly. And in the very end of chapter 18, we see Ahab go out and have a meal. Elijah says to him, go and have a meal. This would have been a ritual meal. So this would have been a covenant renewal meal. And then we see the rain come. Rain, a sign of God's blessing. A sign of covenant faithfulness. And once again, the rain comes from the sea. If you look at verse 44, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. Well, Baal was said to have conquered the sea. Once again, another affront to this useless idol. And we know the story. We know that the people of Israel still don't get it right. And we know that Jezebel is going to continue to want to kill Elijah. And we'll continue that story into next week. But I love how this isn't just an isolated incident on top of a mountain as a contest to show, hey, God's awesome. This is something that's connected all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob saying, hey, this is still me. Hey, when I called Abraham and I called him and I said, hey, you're going to be my follower. That's the same God. And it just goes all the way back. It goes all the way back through the pages of the Old Testament. We see the things that we talked about in Deuteronomy and in Joshua and all of these things coming to fruition. And God reminding the people of the covenant that they made with him back in the time of Moses and Joshua. And God being willing to send a prophet like Elijah to call them back. I think it's interesting because in our culture and context, idol worship sometimes isn't as obvious. And I think that something all of us should spend some time reflecting on is, how do we see idol worship in our own culture? And sure, there are other religions that very much worship idols. But how do we see it creeping into our own American culture and our own American churches? Where do we see that creep, that just slightly one-off? Maybe it's an idol of time, spending our time in the wrong way, or an idol of relationships, or an idol of, you name it, you probably could fill in the blank. Money, success, fame, fortune, all of those things can all be idols. TV can be an idol. Our smartphones could be an idol. Anything that takes the place of God being number one, having that place of number one allegiance in our lives, can be drawing our hearts astray. And we need to learn from the people of Israel and later the people of Judah. There is one God. He is God alone. And we are to love him with all of our hearts, all of our souls, all of our minds, and all of our strength. So that's something that I took away from this passage as I was studying and thinking about it this week. And so I just encourage you to really dwell and think and really pray through these passages. Pray through what you see in our culture and just see what God will have to say to you. We're going to continue this story. Elijah is definitely one of my favorite characters in the whole Bible. So next week, we'll kind of see what's going to happen next. I'll see you later. Bye!